Part of the diagnosis of ADHD is that symptoms emerged in childhood. That people with ADHD know what's happening and they're feeling it as well. It's not like they don't care, and that's the other part of working with folks with ADHD for a long time. It hurts. Yeah, there's pain points to go along with it.
There's a lot of talk about ADHD at the moment, and from a clinical point of view, I really didn't understand what it was. So I invited an expert in the field to come on to the podcast and have a chat about all things ADHD. Episode 116, Russell Ramsay. The One Moment Please podcast.
Yeah.
Welcome to the podcast.
Fiona, thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
Well, I'm excited to have you on. There's a lot of talk about ADHD at the moment, and everyone seems to have ADHD. So just wondering, really, what is it? You're an expert in it. You've studied it. You were at the forefront of doing the cognitive therapy for it. So I really want to understand how you got into it and then what ADHD actually is.
Okay. ADHD found me. I did not go looking for it. It started when I was at the University of Pennsylvania. I was a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Cognitive Therapy at Penn, doing typical cognitive therapy for depression, anxiety, panic attacks, and can track where my life changed to March 8, 1999. Had a meeting with very noted Philadelphia psychiatrist, Dr. Tony Rothstein, still a colleague and a friend and collaborator, a local expert in ADHD in children, and then in his role then as the head of education for adult psychiatry in the medical school. And he was thinking about, that was around the time the book Driven to Distraction had been published, which put ADHD for children back on the map, but really educated a lot of people about the prospect of adult ADHD, that the kids and teens did not invariably grow out of it. So Tony was thinking, well, around this time, it seems like we should have a credible program looking at the assessment and treatment of ADHD. And he just got my name from a colleague who thought, yeah, Russ would be somebody good to collaborate with. And my line about Tony and me is everything interests both of us and we can't say no to work. So he said, how would you like to try to develop a program that focuses on the accurate diagnosis and evidence-supported treatment for ADHD? I shrugged my shoulders and said, sure. And here I am sitting with you talking about everything that's gone on the past, we just passed 25 years this past year. Even though the Penn ADHD program is no longer in existence, but we're still hammering away at it.
So talk to me about what actually ADHD is.
Currently, if we go with the official designation, then we'll go into what it means for people walking around day to day. It's a neurodevelopmental syndrome. That means the features of ADHD. A syndrome reflects the fact that there are these cluster of symptoms and behaviors that go together in a reliable fashion, but it's not necessarily a disease state type of thing where it's a pretty clear cause and effect. And neurodevelopmental means it's part of how your brain works. It's not a separate thing. Like we're increasingly understanding about ADHD. It's not like a thing like diabetes, or that we can say, oh, your blood pressure dropped this much, so we can tell it's probably this, or here's what we're looking at. ADHD, so it's a neurodevelopmental syndrome of impaired self-regulation, or what are called the executive functions. The executive functions are the suite of skills and behaviors that we use to manage ourselves, how efficiently do we do what we set out to do, is a nice synopsis of what the executive functions do. Not an expectation for being a robot and being as efficient at 11:30 in the evening as we are at 10 a.m. in the morning, but within reason. So with ADHD, we're now realizing that it's a dimensional feature, that the fewer...
What does that mean, a dimensional feature?
Well, what it means is it falls on a continuum, like height. We have some people who, little people who are statistically shorter than the average height. There's a large curve in the middle that is the average range. Like I'm about 5'6", 5'7". I stand next to somebody who's 6'2". You'll tell a difference. But I think it's fair to say, or let me just say somebody who's 6 foot or 5'11". You'll tell a difference, but we're both in the average range. I might be at the low end of average. The other person might be at the upper end of average. But once you get out to about, and the numbers might not be precise, but for the illustration, 6'4", 6'5", 6'6", we're going to say those people are statistically tall. You're not going to see, and, it's probably, about, we get up to like the upper, like in height, 6% of the population, NBA players, professional basketball players, or whatever, that we say those are statistically much taller than average, and just like we have it on the other side. So some recent studies specifically on children looked at symptoms of ADHD, looked at a population of children. Some of them had been diagnosed with ADHD, and as part of the study, they also used a screening scale. And there were some children who were not formally diagnosed, but who screened for ADHD, so they were included in the ADHD group. And then they took the screening scale and looked at parents' measures of quality of life for their children. And individuals with no symptoms or 1 or 2 symptoms of ADHD, and this will be an important point that we'll get back to, you can have a lot of symptoms of ADHD without having ADHD because there has to be impairment. The symptoms of ADHD, they're like a fever in medical practice. It's a non-specific symptom. So if I go to my family practitioner or my family doctor with a fever, I could have the flu, I could have an infection, I could have malaria. You need more information. And plus, if my body temperature just runs a little high, but I'm fine, okay, keep doing what you're doing. So in this study, though, going back to the dimensionality, individuals with none or 1 or 2 symptoms, generally pretty good quality of life, ratings by their parents. As we got up more, 4, 5, 6, 7, as the symptoms increased, now in this case, the quality of life ratings would go down. So it'd still be a consistent descent over time. And then once you got up to the maximum, those would be the lowest scores. So it wasn't like this major drop off. Okay, kids are about here, then it drops off when you have ADHD. The more symptoms of ADHD you have, at least in this study, the lower the quality of life ratings were consistently. So the more you have, the worse off you are. So that's what I mean by dimensionality. Going back to the executive functions, in case it's not clear, and sorry, look what you're getting yourself into. You get the geek out. We all have executive functions, and it seems that they would fall on a similar dimensional scale. Some people are very organized, always on time, maybe annoyingly so. The exact person you want to have to be your travel agent, your assistant, or they're the person who gets the tickets for the concert, orders the car, make sure everybody gets there on time. I mean, I'm kidding around a little bit, but it can be very rewarding to have. Most of us are in the middle. Hey, we're doing pretty well. Sometimes we get overwhelmed, but we can bounce back. ADHD is the far, and forgive the clumsy term, but the disordered end of the continuum, where there's more difficulties with the executive functions and more negative life events and effects of them, and, if you will, more impairments. So ADHD is a neurodevelopmental syndrome of impaired executive function, and the executive functions they overlap with the core symptoms of ADHD that are listed in the official criteria. So the symptoms are also part of it and part of making the diagnosis, but they can cluster together. But it's a neurodevelopmental syndrome of this impaired self-regulation, meaning more difficulties, more impairments, more troubles from these life difficulties. And these are the things that are usually the language of the problems that people bring with them when they're asking for treatment. I have a hard time keeping up with everything. I'm chronically late. I forget things. I write things down, but I don't check it. I have a hard time figuring out how long something will last and pacing myself through the day. And not only the effects for the individual, but for adults, effects for parenting, pet ownership, paying bills, interdependence with other people in a study or a work group. So A lot of times ADHD can be dismissed as this nuisance situation. Oh, yeah, you misplace things, you're late all the time. Yeah, but these things can have pretty serious ripple effects. And they can also wear at one's sense of self, because a lot of people find that I can't rely on myself and other people can't rely on me. And those are some of the pain points that can help people recognize, okay, these may be problems and may be the result of ADHD.
So it seems like, to, in layman's terms, summary, very clumsily, everybody can have these symptoms, but the ADHD comes in when it's really impairing your life.
Right. Consistent, chronic, cuts across many domains of life. Now, all of us, we can have a period. We get the flu. We get a new puppy at home, and we have to wake up early. A new baby. Just a very busy time where we're off our game and we sort of fall behind. But most of us, with intact executive functioning, we can adapt. We can get back to a typical normal level. So we might have a rough week as we get over the flu, or a period of poor sleep, or just having a lot of stuff during a busy time of the year, end of school, starting school, finals week, whatever. But most of us can navigate through decently and get back to a normal baseline. I make the case that the thing with ADHD, the baseline is a moving target. Sometimes, and some people, there are some situations, it's very context sensitive, because part of the reasons we humans have executive functions to the level that we do, it was adapting to our environment, and in particular, our increasing social environment of early humans, working and living in larger groups of non-related other human beings, where we had to work and play well with others. And for early humans, that had important survival effects. So there was that pressure. Now, nowadays it's a little different, but those are the same executive functions that we're dealing with right now. But it's usually the language of time management, organization. I can't motivate myself to do the things that I know how to do, and I've done them before, but I can't trust myself to do them when I need to do them. That's what I call the self-mistrust. And that's part of what I'll hear a lot of clients with ADHD say. I know exactly what to do. There's no trade secrets. And I tell my clients, if we're talking about procrastination and all I tell you is start earlier, sue me for malpractice, please. You know that. You've done it before. So another line you'll hear is, ADHD is a performance problem, not a knowledge problem. So it's the implementation, it's the doing of what we know to do, but how do we sequence that, the timing, being able to get ourselves to do it when we need to do it. So that's very often the frustration that comes with ADHD for those living with.
So how does the stress and the cortisol release of pressure and so for example, if you've got a KPI at work or a deadline at work, it seems to me that people with ADHD can hit that because they're aligned and responsible and, I don't know if obligated is the right word, but they're accountable to somebody else. In terms of the executive dysfunction and doing things yourself, there's that, okay, I can't get self-motivated to do it for myself, but you can do it for others people. Where's the disconnect in terms of that?
No, this is some of these situational factors. In terms of, and people will say, I can't get motivated until I have that final deadline coming up in hours or the night before. And, the cortisol, the anxiety acts as a natural stimulant. Now, we could say, well, 48 hours before, you're the same brain, the same deadline maybe, the same task, the same person, but that's where and there can be other things that come up around this related to ADHD, where ADHD makes a lot of life more difficult. So even though it's 3 days before the deadline for work and you know what you need to do, that's where even low-level anxiety, doesn't even have to be a diagnosed anxiety, can start wreaking havoc, where it's like, well, I don't have to do it now. Let me do this other thing first that I'll enjoy more, and then I'll be in the mood to do the task. And if we are, that's fine. but this is where the distractions come in and the difficulties. Emotional regulation is one of the executive functions. It doesn't appear anywhere in the official diagnostic criteria anywhere, but it is a core feature of dealing with ADHD, the discomfort, all the things that go into doing work, things that aren't necessarily fun, but they can be rewarding and they're important, and we know it logically. But this is what a lot of folks with ADHD struggle with, where without that stress of, if I don't do it, I'm going to get in trouble, it won't be ready. And another point you mentioned is the interpersonal effects of, and this could be the positive stress. I want to be responsible to somebody else. I want to be a good worker. Now, these things, the person knows them the 48 hours before, but that's where the stress, the cortisol, the stress acts like a natural stimulant medication to help focus. And then all the same things that are in place before. Well, I could do something else. Now with the stress, and that helps focus more on, I only have 4 hours. I have to get this done. And then people are able to get engaged. And what you'll hear a lot of people say is, once I got started, it wasn't that bad and it went better than I thought. But why can't I do this 2 days, 3 days before without all this stress? Now, I think there are many of the strategies and medications can be helpful with this. That can help people do it, but it does take breaking down all those little things. Why am I convincing myself now, 2 days before the thing is due, the project is due? How do I think myself out of doing the task? How do my emotions, the other emotions, hijack my best plans? And, how do I fall into these escape behaviors that, and sometimes people will escape to doing a household chore or a task, something that's not fun, but in their mindset, they go, I believe I can do this. I'm more confident I can do this now than I can the work project. And there's, different elements of different tasks that we can reverse engineer to help say, well, can we borrow from what works for this task to actually get you on board for the project or other have to or want to tasks later? So it's the stress of the deadline focus or letting somebody down, the body doubling. Oh, I don't feel like going for a walk, but Jamie's going to show up outside my door, so I don't want to disappoint them. That accountability, I think, helps with the executive functions in terms of bringing the priority of the task or the agreement to the foreground. Now, all that being said, sometimes people start missing deadlines. Then they call out sick, make excuses, and that's where a lot of the impairment can happen. And this is also an important point because somebody stays up late, pulls all-nighters to get school or work done, and the boss or the teacher says, yeah, they handed it in on time, but that can also be an impairment because in terms of personal health and well-being, relationships outside of school and work that might suffer from the all-nighter or takes time away to do the task at the last minute, takes time away from other things, including sleep and self-care.
If the emotional dysregulation is such a strong part of the ADHD symptoms, why is it then not a key criteria in regards to the diagnosis?
With respect to the people who come up with the guidelines, they will say, we don't set them out. We reflect where the field's at. So even though emotional dysregulation in some forms like low frustration tolerance, quick to be getting upset about trivial things, they've been documented for a long time. It's only been relatively recently, now we're talking more than a decade at this point, but that it's the more central role they play has become more apparent. Now, also, at least for the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association, the most recent major update was 2013. So it's probably around the time we're appreciating it more. But the work groups are working a long time before that. And also a fair critique is it can be hard to differentiate between the emotional discontrol, the executive functioning piece, and the common coexisting emotional conditions, most commonly anxiety and depression for ADHD. So it can be hard to tease those apart, but I think we may be working towards I can't speak to this directly, but I would imagine the next time, at least for the American Psychiatric Association, they go through and update the diagnostic criteria, that it will be at least considered by the work groups. There were some data going back on the last two diagnostic DSMs, DSM-4 and DSM-5, and researchers compared the core symptoms of ADHD, which I think are pretty consistent with the ICD, the International Classification of Diseases or Disorders. I forget what the D stands for. They're pretty consistent. But with the last two, they added in the executive functions, and in those two studies, both for DSM-4 and the DSM-5 criteria, they found that in the DSM-4, executive functions alone were the best diagnostic indicator, and with the DSM-5 criteria, they found that executive functions and the inattention features fused as one factor, and emotional discontrol did show up as number 4 on the list after the hyperactivity and impulsivity symptoms. So I think there's increased attention, and very often in clinical practice, I think there's greater attention paid to looking for executive functioning as part of in addition to the core DSM ICD criteria, which are part of any gold standard evaluation for ADHD, but also having the broader net, because very often the difficulties show up as the executive functioning problems, the time management, disorganization, poor motivation, poor impulse control, and the emotional discontrol, in addition to a few others.
What are the physical differences between the brain compared to a neurotypical and then a non-neurotypical? Because there's been some talk recently in regards to physical scans are actually different between the two.
You know what? The difference is we're not at a point where we can just do a brain scan, because there are some relatively consistent findings about different regions of the brain that might be a little smaller, develop a little slower until they reach their full size. Some processing difficulties, like that's not the right term. I'm blanking on the right term, but like dopamine availability in some of the reward networks, the subcortical reward networks, and dopamine's as much about reward, what feels good, as it is the anticipation of reward. And going back to that example of why does somebody wait until the last minute all the time when they say, I'm never going to do that again, this is horrible, I could have done so much better had I started earlier. But then it's the next week, there's another thing, and it's harder generating that motivation to do something. And there's things that are more naturally and immediately reinforcing, including sometimes that example we were talking about, somebody saying, well, let me clean up the kitchen first, or the student saying, well, let me do my laundry and let me catch up on laundry, then I'll be in the mood to study for exams, or whatever the case may be. Even though the logical part of the brain knows that's not the best utilization of your time, effort, and energy, but it's how ADHD can overwhelm these things, and people know it after the fact. Two of the most common, at least emotional descriptions you'll hear adults with ADHD describe as guilt and shame, and they're social emotions. Guilt is, I'd made a mistake, and I can make amends, and we can correct it. And shame is, I've violated community standards. I've done something embarrassing. I've done something that is not how I want to be. And very often for the ADHD-related mistakes we're talking about, they probably don't fall into those categories. Yeah, we might be late for a meeting with somebody, and we can apologize or try to be on time next time, the way to make amends. But the feelings are stronger than usually the mistakes warrant, even though they are mistakes and things to work on, like wait until the last minute. But the people with ADHD know what's happening, and they're feeling it as well. It's not like they don't care, and that's the other part of working with folks with ADHD for a long time. It hurts. There's pain points to go along with it.
Is there any talk, and you mentioned that ADHD was a developmental issue,
Yeah.
so therefore in terms of how the brain develops, but is there any truth to that it can be a caused effect based on our sort of social media having the short attention span and the flicking through and the dopamine that causes having those short bursts of entertainment, and that training the brain to have a short of attention span? Is there any truth that social media and the short snippets of those dopamine, I don't know, I don't
Yeah,
even know
yeah.
how to explain it properly, but yeah.
Yeah, what happens, a behavioral way to talk about, like, what happens with a lot of social media. Um, and, there's also some research differentiating from, digital use overall, like going on doing Google Scholar or doing, web searches and things like that, versus social media, where there's a social element of it and repeated checking and things like that, where behaviorally it's called variable ratio reinforcement schedule. So if you're learning something, and you get good job, good job, good job, or you start to be able to play notes on a musical instrument, or you start to understand a sport better or a topic, that every time you study or practice, you get a little better. That regular, consistent schedule. Okay, I'm getting better, 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 better. So that's the way. That's a good way to learn something. A good way to maintain a behavior, or a bad way, depending on what the behavior is a variable ratio reinforcer. And that is, you'll probably get a reward, a payoff, however you define that, but you don't know exactly when it's going to happen. So if it was an old school B.F. Skinner behavioral study, you might have birds pecking at a button, and every time you press the button, you get a treat, or whatever pigeons like to get, a pigeon food, pigeon pellet, a pellet. So they're going to press the button. Then if you stop it, they'll press it for a while, but if they don't get any pellets, they'll stop pressing. But if they press it 5 times, they get a pellet, press, like 20 times get a pellet, they will keep pressing and pressing because, if you keep pressing, something will happen. And that's what social media does. Has anybody liked my post? Do I have another text? There's always something else out there. And game developers and the people who set up the websites know this science. So that's what we're up against. Now, the question of, is this causing attention problems? It is still an empirical question, because there have been studies where you'll see people who have, they'll look at people being online and they'll endorse more symptoms of ADHD. But that, like I said before, having symptoms of ADHD doesn't mean you have ADHD. Because very often we'll hear, like, if people by choice or as part of a study maybe set down their phones or don't go on sites as much, they get back to a baseline. So is it a forever change? I don't know yet. And I think that's an important, vital, and empirical question. But the studies who are showing, the kids who report being, usually the kids, but all us adults are on it as much as the kids almost. But who report more symptoms of ADHD. It doesn't necessarily mean diagnostic levels, and it doesn't mean that they're persistent. Part of the diagnosis of ADHD is that symptoms emerged in childhood. Even if they weren't causing enough problems that they were taken in for an evaluation and got diagnosed in childhood, but people might come in adulthood saying, I've always struggled in school, but now I'm failing out of college, or I'm not keeping up, or I'm at danger of losing my job. Part of the evaluation is going back and asking about, even if somebody got good grades in school, how did they do school? Did they have difficulties that were compensated for? Maybe the parents sat with them to make sure that they did their homework every night because they wouldn't do it on their own. I'm still amazed by how many stories I hear about, I often didn't hand in my assignments, but nothing happened. Or there were other special school situations that might have masked percolating ADHD symptoms, but it may not. And sometimes these might not show up until the middle school years, like the early teen years. So not by the 12 years old that is dictated, established by the APA DSM, but even the age of onset is relatively arbitrary. Now, arbitrary doesn't mean meaningless, because I'm a full believer that it's developmental and there need to be signs and symptoms. But if somebody says, "Oh, I was 13," oh, that's not ADHD. Well, that's not following the dimensional view of it, that very often those 13, 14-year-old years in middle school, where there's more writing assignments, more reading assignments, more homework to do on your own, or organizing other activities in social life. That's what the executive function. Originally they were designed to help us stay alive as humans, but managing our context, our reasonable environmental demands, and that's why ADHD is so context sensitive. And some people there are some contexts or subjects that they enjoy. Oh, I got an A+ in that class. Yeah, there was a lot of reading, but it was history. I love history. But a simpler class like short stories or poems, oh, I can't get through even a 5-line poem or whatever the case may be. So it is very context sensitive, that there are some situations where students, adults can do very well. But a lot of the ones, and very often what brings people in, are school, work, and relationship difficulties. So, going back to the digital question, at least so far, it seems like, yes, there might be greater endorsement of ADHD symptoms because those are the questionnaires being used. And I'm not hand-waving this away. I think it should be studied, but generally there's the question of, does that reflect the full syndrome? And the ADHD symptom scales that are being used are not executive functioning scales. So that would be part of the question of, and that could even be a better way to measure it, to see if it's getting at executive functions. Now, one of the other questions I would have, though, is, and there is a difference, and again, I think this is an important question, because also what happens sometimes, somebody as an adult may get a head injury, and they've never had a history of ADHD, but then all of a sudden the head injury, post-concussion syndrome, whatever it may be, now creates executive functioning problems. Now, that can look a whole lot like ADHD, but it's not the neurodevelopmental syndrome of ADHD. But one of the other questions would be, and I know there are some therapeutic games developed for ADHD, but I guess the question would be, like, some of those, if the, and I know the social media and the other sites have a lot more compelling features that draw people in and keep them drawn in. But if those are changing it, why are we not having better results on some of the therapeutic games now? And why aren't those sticking as much as we think the negative side is? Again, this should be studied, and it is being studied. Jonathan Haidt, look, The Anxious Generation.
It is.
Yeah. No, so I think it's important to be studied to really tease it apart, because that is a reasonable hypothesis, that we have a generation of kids growing up with it, immersed in it.
It's just if you come at it from our brains have plasticity in terms of we can learn new things and we can adapt, and in terms of training the brain and keeping it useful to help dementia and so forth as well, then it would stand to reason as a hypothesis that it would also be trained as an attention deficit as well, if we're just focusing on shorter and shorter and shorter things and not having to listen to an hour-long lecture at school. And the school structure I want to get into with you.
And that's also, the lectures are personal. Even and again, this is one remove from us being in person, but there is a difference with the attention with real people in real settings. And no, I think, and even with the neuroplasticity, going back to the early studies on stroke recovery, the neuroplasticity came from grueling, like having a person pick up like utensils or pencils for hours in a day. So the neuroplasticity, I believe in it, but it has also been romanticized in a way of, yes, learning changes the brain and all the positive things. And this is also a pitch for getting off our phones for breaks and things like that, and the portion control with it, where that would also be the question, just like what somebody stops smoking and there's all the benefits that start happening right away. Now there's going to be some cumulative negative benefits, but starting the progress of the brain and body's adaptive capacity. Now I don't want to oversell this. Oh, I'm going to start smoking because this Ramsay guy said no. I mean, there's many harmful effects of many things, but also the benefits of our brain health and having a variety of things, and social media, our phones, our tools. So I don't want to sound like I'm minimizing this at all, but there's still some questions in there, especially around is it creating ADHD? And it could be. There are these documented, the increase in ADHD rating scale scores, but interesting looking at the executive functioning scores too. But yeah, moderation in all things.
With it being a developmental issue, why is it that women now are getting diagnosed in adulthood at greater rates? And I think there's a part of that in terms of there's more awareness of it now, what the symptoms are that comes with social media, but also why are they not picked up as much as they are with boys? If it's the same condition, why is it presenting so differently?
There are some difference in manifestations and disruptive behaviors. So this will be an unfair gender bias, but illustrative example, like for children, like a way to think about it, just for illustration of this point, is young boys' ADHD gets seen in the classroom, where girls are more likely to show up on the playground. And the impulsivity might show up in social relationships, and that's where the problems show up. But those are things that may not lead educators, with all respect to them or other people, to think ADHD right away. And more likely, it's not more. One of the myths, I think, has been women are more likely to present with the inattentive presentation of ADHD without the hyperactivity and impulsivity. Now, that may be true in terms of some of the overt signs of the hyperactivity and impulsivity, but there can be emotional impulsivity, verbal impulsivity, and even though it's not in the official criteria, the emotional dysregulation along with the distraction. So it may not show up in the ways that it shows up for young boys. So I think that's why the increased diagnosis in women in adulthood, what we would call late identified, not late onset. They had it all along, but it only got identified later because the hyperactivity and impulsivity that was there didn't look like ADHD, because it might be showing up more in relationships, in tasks, and maybe less likely to be disruptive. And I think I'm right on this, if I remember the research correctly, that women with ADHD were less likely to at least show up with overt learning problems. Not that they don't exist. I want to be clear about this. But compared with boys, they weren't having as many overt school difficulties that signaled ADHD to people around them. So when we look at it by adulthood, the gender distribution is almost equal, which I would imagine, because many of the studies about the boys outnumbering girls by like 10-1, that was like clinic referred children. So I think we just have more understanding about what ADHD looks like in girls, young women, and women.
So what would be a social impulsive? You said it shows up more on the playground. So what would be an example of that impulsivity in a social setting?
But, for children, for school age years, starting with younger, difficulties following the rule of a game, turn taking, maybe jumping in, wanting to do things other ways, somehow disrupting the expectation, usually within a group. And then that's where exclusion can start happening, active rejection, where you can't play with us anymore, or passive rejection. And this is like with smartphones. Yeah, why am I not on the group text anymore? So it's, for lack of a better phrase, it can be what's seen as annoying behavior, and not following the rules of the group. It can be talking too much, turn taking in conversation, saying the wrong things, saying the thing that was a secret, or whatever things like that. And that can get worse later on, like for adolescent girls. And it can be now more again, saying the wrong thing, reacting in anger, overreactions. And this is where things like forgetfulness, lack of follow through from the inattention that can show up in school, but also can get in the way of social settings, and also at home with chores and things like that. And then usually we're getting into college, we can also start seeing more of the school related difficulties, later in middle school and high school, and then into college more. But usually early on, it's like the rules of the game, violating the rules of conversation, these unspoken rules, and the other things. And I'm not saying these are the best features of human nature, but we do divide ourselves up in the group. It's part of our factory settings. It can be done for good things too. But on the playground, that's where it might not show up as much in the classroom, where the teachers might see it and it's part of a teacher conference.
If there's been a lot to be said about ADHD being a attention deficit disorder, that is the title of it, are the modern classrooms of sitting a child in a classroom setting with 30 kids and having a teacher talk at them, or have a classroom situation for 90 minutes, is that current structure the way that ADHD kids should be learning?
It's a professional response. I always have to go, it depends. But, and a way to think about the attention deficit, we were really thinking about more of it like an attention allocation, because like you said, if somebody enjoys something, and, the classic view of the teacher standing in front of the seated children in nice rows and delivering a didactic verbal lecture. I think it was said something like, comparing it with 100 years ago, you won't see anything that looks familiar to the person 100 years ago. Now this might be changed a little bit, other than a classroom, with the teacher standing up front. Now we have technology that, that 100 years, maybe we have to push it back. But there are different ways to use, and with technology, we do have more things like slides rather than, but going back to, it depends, because sometimes people say if it's a dynamic speaker, if the speaker's passionate about things, but in general, there might be a lot of students for which that alone is not the best way to get information. And in fairness to educators, I think there is an increased recognition of different learning styles, or at least different ways to present information and group projects and, hands-on learning and other things. But there's, and I also appreciate the limitations of, trying to get to everything in a typical class day. How many ways can you, present information? So, but that's, I think educators are really trying to do a better job with trying to find the individualization of, or at least different ways to reach different students. But that's something that along the way, and as you're asking about, doing an evaluation of an adult going back to school, seeing the situations that they did well in, looking for cues about, situations they can put themselves in now as adults. But sometimes the dry lecture, people zone out, and that's where you'll hear about the daydreaming and whatnot. And even nowadays, at least in colleges and some medical schools and graduate schools, they'll have recorded lectures. That way students can go back, and sometimes students with ADHD or other people too, they'll say, I'll watch the lecture on double speed, because that cadence, then I can stay focused, because the information's coming fast enough but too fast that it holds my attention better.
Is with the gut being labeled the second brain, is there any correlation or impact that diet and food has on the symptoms of ADHD?
You know what? I'm not. I'm hearing more about the gut brain connection in various other ways. So I can't say that I'm up to date on it. But certainly that attending to broadly our health in many ways. They may not be treatments for ADHD, but they certainly support good brain functioning and coping with ADHD and follow through on things. So I can't speak as much to that specifically, but I mean, it makes sense. We're seeing all the ripple effects, of different systems. And, I'm also interested in the vagal nerve, polyvagal system, and, with, the negative emotional effects of ADHD and the experiences of ADHD and experiencing criticisms and setbacks and, sense of, lack of self-trust and even maybe not lack of safety in terms of like trauma safety, but lack the challenges faced by things that other people seem to handle effortlessly day to day, how these are more struggles for folks with ADHD. We mentioned the stress and avoidance. That, it's like, a lot of tasks are like food poisoning. People tell me it's good for me, but every time I do it, it doesn't end up making me feel well. So it's harder for me to pick it up and do it. So it makes sense.
I was more
Not up to date on that literature, but it seems like there are some important connections and ways to boost overall function. I wouldn't want to oversell it. Just like if
yeah.
anybody has food sensitivities or allergies, certainly take care of that. But my understanding of the research is like additives and things like that don't necessarily cause the wide-ranging presentation of ADHD.
What about and again, I recognize the fact that you said you're not across it, and this is coming from someone that's got no medical training or dietitian training at all. But in terms of the blood sugar release, I would have thought from a keto diet, if you're not having those fluctuations in blood sugar, which has been linked to moods in terms of huge sways in blood sugar moods. If you're leveling that out, I would have thought that would have helped with the emotional dysregulation.
I mean, like I said, it would certainly make a contribution. And one of the issues with self-regulation and the executive functions, and this is important because one of the other things we're understanding now, research on ADHD, including some developmental research, is the effects of ADHD on monitoring your health, following through on recommendations and well health and preventative health visits, but also tracking somebody's hunger or blood sugar during the day, be it just your sense of body, your proprioception. How am I feeling right now? Am I hungry? And a lot of people, I don't notice I'm hungry. Now, that can be a side effect of prescribed stimulant medications, because stimulants are appetite suppressants, including caffeine. But also sometimes people say, I don't realize how hungry I am till later. I don't realize how tired I am or the need for a break. So it would make sense that these would correlate with the blood sugar level, and whether that's something that's informally tracked. I have to make sure I at least get some food in me sometime midday, even if it's almost like treating like food and snack and hydration as like another prescription. Or if it is more formally tracked, it's like, oh, okay, this is why I'm having a hard time getting motivated, or I'm more short-tempered. It's another tool in the tool belt. So yes, this is where all these things would apply, and would be useful to track for overall well-being and managing ADHD, some of these effects.
And particularly considering ADHD also, it has low dopamine and low norepinephrine. Is that norepinephrine?
Oh, norepinephrine.
Okay, thank you. See, not a medical professional.
Well, you're doing great. Don't, because I forget these things too. So, yeah.
And when you're you're chasing that dopamine hit through food or through the social media or through anything like that, it also does make sense in regards to the
going back
food.
to women through the menstrual cycle too, and going into perimenopause and menopause.
Oh, that's interesting. So are you finding that a lot of women are presenting more because they're going through perimenopause and their symptoms are getting worse?
That can happen. And sometimes people say, yeah, I always thought something was going on, and now it's like it's exploding. There's also been interesting that some women without any history of ADHD going through perimenopause and menopause might say, all right, all of a sudden this is affecting my brain. And there's actually some studies done. Tom Brown, who's very, a leading expert in ADHD, and I'm blanking on my colleague's name at Penn. She's a leader in this. K. Neil Epperson. She was at Penn when I was there, and she and Tom did a study looking at women without ADHD, but were presenting with a lot of attention and executive functioning issues, and they did well on some prescribed stimulant medication for ADHD. That helped with those symptoms. So even though they didn't have ADHD, those symptoms helped because, going through perimenopause and menopause, they were having many of these symptoms, and they did well, with, at least it was researched, the use of a prescribed stimulant for ADHD. Yeah, women with ADHD then going through menopause. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
Was there another group in that study that went through hormone replacement to help see if that controlled there?
I don't know.
Yeah.
I forget. I'd have to look back at the study. But no, this is Sandra Kooi, Kooj in the Netherlands. She's a leading expert on this and is looking at, cardiac health and hormone replacement therapy and a whole host of things with, women in general, women and girls in general, but also in this age range. So she's at the forefront of this.
Why is it that people with ADHD, they often get referred to as having that superpower in regards to being able to judge people and read people that others think that are amazing, but they think they see the red flags? Where does that come from in regards to the differences in terms of the brain?
Well, can you say, because I'm used to people describing their ADHD as a superpower, but you would say, I maybe I lost it a little bit on terms of the red flags that people may be seeing.
So the ADHD is a superpower, but part of that superpower is being able to assess and call. So if you think that someone's okay and someone with ADHD meets that person, they'll be able to go, they're a snake, don't trust them. And everyone around them thinks that the sun shines out of their who's what's it. Yeah. Where does that come from?
Well, I'm not familiar with any research supporting that, but if it's anecdotal, or at least I've not seen it.
It's a true thing, Russell. Just go with it. It's absolutely 100% true. Let's get some clinical studies on it.
If you said it, it is. No, but a reasonable hypothesis would be that, again, the social aspect of ADHD, this is something I've always been, like I said, going back, everything interests me. But, paying even more attention to, because a reasonable hypothesis would be, so like we said, it's not an attention deficit, it's an attention allocation problem. Now here's another thing that I've been trying to find, even if it's an estimate how it was based, but and I forget the person's name who it's out there with tied to the rejection sensitivity with ADHD, that children with ADHD get, by the time they reach adulthood, they have 20,000 more criticisms than anybody else. So again, it's out there on the internet, so it must be true. I've been looking for references for it. Even if it's an estimate, even if they say, okay, this week, these kids got 10 more, and if we extrapolate that out over 18 years, I'd be fine with it.
Well, it makes sense if they're not able to conform to the social norms and they're fidgety and they're not
Right.
Yeah.
Well, so that's what we're talking about here, bringing it back. And so it's attention allocation problem. They probably have a history of the eye rolls, the heavy sigh. Why can't you be like your brother? And why can't you just get it done? And all these signals, and when they're starting and in adolescence and all the tells that, they might not like me. Now, they could be wrong, but they're probably overly sensitive to it because they're overly trained to it. So that would be a hypothesis that they're attuned to, people who, now this might be different than somebody who's a snake or something like that, but they might pick up on yeah, this sounds sort of, there might be some pattern recognition in there where they're picking up on something that, some subtle cues and putting them together quickly. That other people go, no, this person sounds great. We want to bring them on board. It's like, I don't know. They rub me the wrong way. So that's just a hypothesis.
Energies. It would be interesting to see whether or not they can pick up on energies more. That would be also an interesting thing, as we're all energy. You mentioned in regards to just then the rejection sensitivity disorder that with ADHD. Is that hand in hand? Is that always the case if you've got ADHD?
I don't think so necessarily. Well, and this is what I mean. Dr. William Dodson was really the one who really identified the rejection-sensitive dysphoria. And, it's been around in a little bit with different personality disorders, certain depressions and things like that. But, he really, saw it in his clinical practice, and he says with the utmost respect. And I, at least in some of my readings, usually through things like Attitude magazine or things like that posted, because it sounded like he tried to publish on this, but he couldn't get papers published elsewhere, so relying on air. But I think it would be fair to say that he would say it's probably more common than not. It would probably be more the exception that somebody doesn't experience this in some way due to having lived with ADHD for so long and all the social things that we're talking about. How I put it together, it makes sense how it can be a thing that might be very prominent for some people, less so for other. I mean, some people have the opposite. They have a short memory and they go, oh, somebody was upset with me, I'm on to the next thing. But how it makes sense to me is, one, like we're saying, life is more difficult if you have ADHD, more likely to experience rejection events, criticisms, things like that. And I'm blanking on her name, but somebody she did research on the adults with ADHD, their experience of criticisms and how it was categorized and things like that. So, it has effects, obviously. And we have the emotional dysregulation. It's harder to manage emotions, to self-soothe, to motivate to do things. And it is more difficult to play by the rules or follow through on things or, make amends. So that, for me, is sort of like the recipe for, it makes sense that later on you're going to be more sensitive, more on guard for rejections, maybe withdrawing more. It's safer if I don't do anything. But maybe, and it can be accurately picking up on criticisms and rejections and people not treating you nicely, but as well as potentially overestimating. Or the person with ADHD says, oh, I was late for lunch. This person probably doesn't want to get together with me for lunch again, and therefore holds back on inviting the friend to lunch. And then it can become like a self-fulfilling prophecy when maybe the other person goes, oh, you're late. No problem. Next time, just text me ahead of time. We should do this again sometime. And they don't hold that thought. But it certainly makes sense why it's certainly something to pay attention to.
If you're living with somebody with ADHD, if you're in a relationship with somebody with ADHD, what is the main thing that partner or household can do to help support the ADHD person and make life more easy within the household? Because there's a huge amount of stress for a husband that's dealing with an ADHD wife and a wife that's dealing with an ADHD husband.
Right.
So how do you support and get the things done that you need to do as a couple and then not create that conflict? Is this too big of a question, Russell?
No. I'm a clinician. This is the stuff I deal with every day. That's why, this is, if I had to pick one, again, this goes back to my field that, it depends. Every situation is different. And it's two levels of it. One, I think regular coordination meetings, getting on the same page. That would be daily. It could be daily check-ins. And this is pretty hard to do. It's like one of these things, like a lot of things in my field, like deep breathing, releasing muscles. Really easy to do, but what I just did just now is probably the first time I did that on purpose in this past week. So, the flossing after you brush your teeth, there's a lot of things that make sense. They're relatively easy, but they're hard to do. So, but having regular check-ins, a shared calendar, which might include things like, and which could include things like, when do you have to pick me up at the train station, paying men up bills, but also part of the coordination could be let's set up auto payments. So it could be coordinating schedules, but also coordinating plans for the household. When are we going to do this? And maybe setting it up to times to do together. That way there's body doubling. Embedded in that, and now some people might be able to get by with it like a couple times a week, like once over the weekend and once during the week. Embedded in that is, the spirit of cooperation and an understanding of ADHD. Russ Barkley, he had a nice book about this a few years ago. He had a nice book about most everything ADHD, but when someone you love has ADHD, and I think it's fair to say he has said at times to say, treat ADHD with a disability mindset. Now, for some people, ADHD is a continuum, but having that understanding of what ADHD makes more difficult, and this can also come up with part of that coordination, the planning meetings, the check-in meetings, if you will. It could be coordination of household chores. And, there might be things that the ADHD partner says, I'm better at the hands-on chores, taking out the recycling, things like that, where I can see it and feel it, but bills and things like that. Now, the other partner might say, hey, I'm not wild about doing the bills either. So, but just negotiate, the negotiation. And folks with ADHD, the partner with ADHD, there's also where the partner without ADHD, it might be some understanding there's going to be slip-ups and mistakes despite all the best plans. Oh, I forgot to look back at the calendar that we set up or log on to it. And the person with ADHD might go, well, I can't just select all the chores I want to do and not anything I don't want to do. There might have to be some quid pro quo, some reciprocity. So in terms of coping skills, utilizing treatments, there's a phrase out there, ADHD is not your fault, but it is your responsibility. Now, it doesn't mean people can do everything, but, using the supports and, both partners having, this can be oversold, but, a sense of good humor about things. Now, there'll be mistakes that are frustrating. But then later on, after the frustration passes, there can be the reframe of, well, this is what happens with ADHD, and also that reminder of, what can be some of the positive traits that were and hopefully still are attractive, and, some of the things that, and this is good for any couple, but, still work really well in the relationship, and looking for the flowers in the garden as much as the weeds, and hopefully there's more flowers.
Why does body doubling work so well? Is it just that you're then accountable to somebody else?
It's it's immediate and hands-on, and it allocates attention. And it's sort of, we were talking about this a little bit earlier on about, be it the cortisol or somebody doing it for somebody else. It is another way to generate emotions about the task. This person's relying on me. Now, again, that can be something that's too far away if the person's not present. But if somebody shows up to go for a walk, now, again, this could be beneficial for anybody, like personal trainers at the gym. We're paying a trainer to do the workout at the gym we're paying a membership for, but knowing somebody's there and that commitment, and this is the social side of ADHD. I don't want to be late for them. So that helps people, or I have a meeting with my supervisor to provide the update on the project. So I think it's part of that positive side of human nature there. And it would be something like somebody showing up for a walk or to a study buddy to say, well, I can't say no now. I wouldn't go to the library to study, but my friend showed up, so I should go. So some of the the adaptive social pressure that goes along with that is also emotional, and they're there. You know what? The other thing is, even though that example of walking to the library to study with a friend, you're not studying yet, but now studying is part of an action sequence. My friends here, we're going to walk to the library, and you started the sequence of getting there. Now you could get to the library and get distracted talking or walk around and not do it, but you've just exponentially increased the likelihood of following through. So making a task manual is like one of those things in CBT for, people with procrastination getting started. How do you touch the task? How do you make it manual so it's real and not just lost in your head? And there's actually within the field of cognition, there's what's known as 4E cognition, and it's looking at how our brain evolved in obviously physical settings and dealing coping with the environment. And now I don't have the E's memorized yet, but it's embodied.
I was just writing them down, Russell.
Yeah,
I was writing them down. I was ready to go.
No. So it's I'm still doing readings on it. But it's embodied because this is why moving around and getting to the place and getting hands-on, touching the task, we're doing something, and that energizes our brain. That would be the inactive. Embodied. It's embedded, because we evolved in context. That's where the executive functions, dealing with other people, dealing with situations, pacing out our work. And, if we can get to where we're, if we can get to the library or get the book we're going to read or reread the last 2 paragraphs I wrote in the chapter I'm working on or something like that. I still haven't I haven't produced anything new, but now I'm engaged, and there's another E in there too. So embedded, inactive, embodied. I can't think of the other one. 3 out of 4 is not bad though. So reinforced partial success. No, but I think it's a counterpoint to like the information processing view of the brain. And I don't think either of them are wrong. I think they're nested together. They complement one another. But the 4E, I think it's, there was a nice popular book on this a couple of years back, The Extended Mind by Annie Murphy Paul. It wasn't about ADHD, specifically, but just how the environment, our work setting, can affect our cognition, like the feedback loop between us and the environment, and other things that are helpful for engaging our brains.
In a work situation, as a standard practice, what can leadership and management put in place to help people that they suspect ADHD, or as a default practice?
One, remove all open office space. That was one of those things from the extended mind. As nice as it sounds to have everybody available to everybody, we also need to go away and organize our thoughts and think alone. So that whole open office space, that's a recipe for distraction, maybe for anybody. And even if there's, just due to the space or whatever, allowing people with ADHD to either like use earphones for whatever the right noise is, brown noise, pink noise, whatever noise, or music, because that works for some people, instrumental music, but whatever as a screening tool, or go into a closed office space where they can close the door, like to work on some projects. Yes, there may be needs, to interact with others and be parts of meetings and things like that. But when there's high cognitive load tasks like writing assignments or projects where, being able to, limit, the physical distractions, I think, this is another, like I said, I'm interested in everything. Thinking about some of these accommodations, most of I've been doing this 25 years. So things like Dragon Naturally Speaking or voice to text software, now they're on our phones, they're on, our word processing. So it's not like, oh, you got to get this software. No, it's in the software you're already using. So allowing people to write reports, voice to text. Oh, as an aside, speaking of the 4E, that's another way for, if you're writing, if you have ADHD and you get stuck writing or expressing your thoughts, say them out loud, because we're conversational creatures. We have to learn to write, but we're going to, barring a language difficulty, we're going to learn whatever language we're raised in and be able to speak it relatively fluently. So that's a way to just speak aloud and then, write that. Yeah, make it sound easy, but it is a way to get unstuck. But voice to text software. But another domain is maybe time accommodations. Going back to the body doubling, if there's a larger project, okay, here's your piece of the project, deliver it in 90 days, have weekly check-ins or maybe weekly assignments related to the project. That's a little more work maybe for the supervisor to have a weekly, maybe you can get by with 10 minutes, maybe it's 30 minutes, or maybe some, weekly, or it doesn't have to be that much, but okay, here's your task for the week. Just like what was done in education, rather than you have a 5-page essay, it's due at the end of the month. It's come to see me, get your topic approved. Bring me your outline. Bring me a first draft. The graduated deadlines, same thing in the workplace. So it may be a little more time for supervisors, but I would predict, if this has been studied, the payoff or follow-through would be better. Because, one of the things that showed up in research on ADHD in the workplace is presenteeism. You're at work, but underproductive. Now, I get it. The 21st century world, we're, in between, I'm buying books on Amazon. That's how I probably got that extended mind book, or things that we take these micro breaks. But we're talking about really being off work tasks, like really, like I was working with one gentleman and said, yeah, I hate to say this, but I usually don't start doing anything productive till 1 p.m. and everybody thinks I'm so dedicated because I stay late, but I'm just catching up on my day. But that would be another thing. To the degree possible, I know there's some professions that this might not be, but you're an emergency department physician, or, it has to be housed whenever. But if there can be flexible work hours. Now, a lot of this if we are post-pandemic, with hybrid work and flexible schedules, somebody says, like that gentleman I just mentioned, hey, if I need to come in, and I can come in from 1 to 8 p.m. and not have to come in the morning, if that helps, it might help the business because there's somebody there later on. So flexibility in business as usual. And again, I understand that some jobs might say, no, we have to be here at certain times. But there's usually more flexibility, and even asking ourselves, well, why are we doing this? Are we doing this because this is the way we've always done it? And is there a rationale for it? Or, is there a possibility for, greater flexibility? But being able to go somewhere and reduce distraction spaces for certain work tasks, including earphones, and the time accommodation, the check-ins, especially on larger projects.
We've used the disability word, and we've sort of painted a very negative picture in terms of ADHD and the struggles. What are the benefits that to ADHD? Because it is described by many that have it as a superpower.
Right. I'm interested. There's a lot of questions, and I even hear this from people, because some people, like I saw something like on social media, but pushing back against the S word, because some people say, I'm not seeing this. I got a lot of kryptonite around me. I don't see the benefits. So there is, and I get where the question's coming from, but I feel duty bound to say, some people would question whether the symptoms themselves, but I get where it's coming from. In terms of the research, the interview research, asking people about their experiences, and one of them, and I like the phrase, talks about the dual nature of ADHD. So, talking about the difficulties already. Some of the benefits seem to be like the mental energy, and when something is interested, being able to get locked into it, or even it doesn't necessarily
the hyper-focus.
Well, the hyper-focus, I'm going to table that. I'm going to set that to the side. So getting focused on something, and it doesn't always have to be only the things we like. Somebody could say, once I get involved in my project, I have the mental energy. So even if it's work or a chapter that they say, okay, I have to read this for my English literature class, but they say once they get into it, they can get energized to do it. So there's that capacity for that that cognitive energy. Now, the hyperfocus is one that often gets cited, and it's probably another one that's on a continuum of, and I'm not going to deny anybody that, including the all-nighter. Okay, once it's the night before, I get hyperfocus. I don't get up. I don't do anything. I get it done. Great. Perfect. You got to get it done, and it's nice to know that you can do it. There's also the line that crosses into perseveration, not being able to disengage when that would be the better thing to do. And, excuse me, maybe it ends up being self-defeating because I did really I passed this one class, but I never get around to the other classes. I'm exaggerating to make the point there. But the hyper-focus and that ability to get into something is often cited as something. And adventurousness, this gets into the creativity, but it's that combination of being able to, at least on reports, put things together in novel ways, if you will, outside the box thinking, even though some people will say, but then I have a hard time describing how I put it together, who people go, that's interesting, talk me through your thought process. Some people are able to do that really well, but some people say, it takes me a while, or I have to work on how did I get there, like if they're sharing it in a team. But that ability, and even living with ADHD and growing up with it, might fuel some creativity. How do I get myself to do it? How do I color code, or how do I set up my planner so I'll use it? Or how do I set up my room or office so I don't get distracted, or whatever the case may be. There also, there seems to be, the desire for connection and humanism, if you will, caring about others. There's one of the things, we talked about, I forget what it was that we said, I'm not sure if it's a thing, but one of the things I think there's been some research on, like, injustice sensitivity, like being particularly sensitive to perceiving others being wronged or hearing word of that. I think there's some, initial look at that, but going back to that desire and that, connection with others. And again, this goes back to like the kids and maybe the girls on the playground, maybe wanting it so much, it can maybe sometimes being overdoing it, or, things like that, that at least at those ages in the peer group, they go, oh, that's a little much, or no, calm down, or whatever the case may be. Those are some of the oh, go ahead. Those are some of the main things that there's some others. Well, and it's also like finding the right fit, like hands-on work, fast-paced work that matches the cadence, that keeps the interest, working with others, and that builds on the body double.
I was going to say more
that can be more good fits. Yeah.
More chaotic, so you've got the dopamine release, but also the high pressure, the sales roles, the really fast paced environments. They don't have that ability to.
And like construction, or I think even back in the day, I think the Attention Deficit Disorder Association did a workplace survey. Now this is going back a ways, but things like even performers, law enforcement, or people out and doing things, the work, their office is the world, or the performance, or the other people, where it would be really hard to procrastinate. Are you going to procrastinate if you're playing a musical instrument, or you're in the middle of a play, or you're out and about, in the community, like a first responder or whatever? There are some like hands-on performance-based activities that might be good fits, where the structure is external. We've got a call, we have to go on this call, or we're building this house, we have to be there today and put it together.
If someone suspects that they've got ADHD, but they're in a work environment that facilitates, like what you've just mentioned, the first responders, or the sales roles, or whatever it might be, that suit that personality type, leave it there as regards to personality type. Understanding it's really not.
Yeah. Well, that's their style. Yeah.
Yeah. Is there a need for them to say you actually need to get properly diagnosed, so when you retire and you don't have that stimulus, you don't basically crumble in terms of being able to function?
You know what? Even with those other jobs, they're not meaning to spoil a good, all the benefits. like the contractor, the person building the house, they might still, though, have to create the bill and do the administrative work, or even the emergency room physician who's really good with patients and can bounce around from room to room and help a lot of people. They eventually have to do their documentation or keep their license up to date or all their continued. So there's usually, even within these other things, some of these organizational issues that maybe aren't a defining feature of the job, but that's what they'll get the notices about from their employer. So there may be some other things that come up there. But in terms of actually getting the diagnosis, I mean, where I thought you were going with it was, do I have to disclose to my employer? And in a way, one answer is you never actually have to, because you could always go in on a behavioral side and say, you know what, boss, I'm really not a morning person. If we could adjust my schedule that I can come in and start my shift at 11 and I'll stay till 7 in the evening, that would work for me, and I think would benefit the store or whatever it is, because we'd have more coverage later in the day when other people have left the office. So can we try this for a while? Or it could be for childcare or something like that. You don't necessarily have to say it. If you're going for formal accommodations that may not be forthcoming, there you might, well, somebody doesn't have to say ADHD even if they've been diagnosed with ADHD, and they might still get informal accommodations. If you want to get formal accommodations at work, then it might be, I mean, some places are getting a lot better, I think, not perfect by any stretch of the imagination. But, you know, if you're going through HR or something like that, they might need some sort of documentation. So it might be good to have. And even if it's for, they go, okay, I don't have to bring this up at work, but because I'm taking medications or seeing a therapist or a coach, that helps me cope better with work. That might be helpful there. And to your point of having it in place for retirement, you know, we're having more and more senior adults. And senior is sometimes defined as 50 or over, and other times 60.
Oh, God, that's depressing.
Well, I know. I'm 58, so I like the 60 definition, at least for the next year and a half or so, or however long it's going to be. Sorry, kidding. No, but more people coming in. And this could also be mid or later career where they go, it's getting harder and harder for me to stay on top of things. Now, again, with technology and things and weekend things, and sometimes that can be somebody without ADHD, but it's a situational adaptation. Okay, you're right, it is taking some different skills. There's an adjustment period, but other people go, I was already staying late, waking up early as a way to compensate for ADHD, and now it's too much. Or, and other people just realizing and hearing about it more. Or they just delayed seeking help for it until later on, and maybe retirement where they go, yeah, now that I don't have the structure of work or other whatever else would structure, and more than somebody would expect, they say, I've tried this, I've tried that, I'm having a hard time. Now that's usually a big adjustment for anybody going into retirement. It's what happened during the lockdowns, during the pandemic. And a lot of where people were doing school and work from home and not having to get up and go out and things like that, which was a blessing for some, but things fell apart for others. And as like many of my clients were saying, now people are seeing what every day was like for me before the pandemic, trying to organize yourself and having a trouble doing it, and the chaos that a lot of people faced. But bringing it back to, you know what, yeah, you could get, you can get a solid assessment even if you choose, until your retirement years, however that's defined. You don't seek out the evaluation until then. Again, just because, even though we call them ADHD evaluations, this is a little side note. And I remind people this is still an evaluation, because people will say, I want to confirm the diagnosis of ADHD. Well, that's not my job. It's assessing for it and considering it along with other things, including medical conditions, other things that can look like ADHD, but aren't, and hopefully for which there are treatments. And some of the evaluations I've been most proud of are the ones where I go, I don't think this is ADHD. And I explain fully why. And people will say, I have attention problems. Yes, you do. But these are not resulting from this neurodevelopmental syndrome. It's from this situational or this potentially other factor. But all that going back to, certainly we have more and more people, I'll just include myself, in their 50s and later, who might be seeking a first-time evaluation, and you can get a thorough one that differentiates ADHD and might rightly identify it, or say this is an adjustment issue, or other things that may be going on as well as like a possible depression without ADHD, even though depression often goes along with ADHD.
Now, you're on the cognitive therapy side of things, not so much the medication side
I'm a
of things.
psychologist. I do not prescribe medications, correct.
So what would be, and again, this is not, I'm sure all the listeners understand and will reiterate it, it's not medical advice. You need to go and seek your own diagnosis and treatments and specific to themselves. But in terms of what would be the most important cognitive therapy that you found amongst the patients that you've treated that they're seeking or that helps them? Because there is an element of you can white knuckle it and just do cognitive therapy in terms of treatment, correct?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people might have gone through, before they recognize they had ADHD, sometimes people, and this is something going back to why women are getting diagnosed maybe more frequently, because before, many of their issues, I'm speaking about girls and women, well, especially probably like older teens, young women and women, might have been first seen, and maybe not wrong, the depression or anxiety or both, and they got treatment for that. And didn't see that it was the ADHD creating those coexisting conditions in the first place. So I think that's another reason there's more women getting diagnosed now. But, so they might have gone through, cognitive behavioral therapy and been better. I'm not as anxious. I'm not as depressed. But I say, and that's part of the benefit of CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, being adapted for adult ADHD, is that it still comes from, it can be helpful for the depression and anxiety. But in terms of, in terms of what elements can be most helpful about it in a court?
Because you don't just go, okay, let's come in and have a counseling session. You talk about practical things that they can put into their life in terms of structure. Yeah.
What the structure is, and it can talk about larger issues like somebody's doing a job search. Well, what's going to be a good fit for me? What do I want to do with my time? Or is this person the one for me? It covers, like I remind people, it's still cognitive behavioral therapy. I can do other things with ADHD, but usually a lot of these things are going through the lens of ADHD. But tell you what, the things that are most helpful, and I'll tell people, and it's a collaboration, but say, the session agendas are usually related to something coping with ADHD, but usually a day-to-day example of that. Like if we're talking about procrastination, is there something you've been procrastinating on leading up to today? Or is there something coming up that you want to get a head start on? And sometimes a very first session could be talking about, I still haven't unloaded the dishwasher or folded laundry or something like that. And it may not be the most important thing for that person, but I'll remind them, we procrastinate on the small stuff the same way we do the big stuff. So even if today we go, okay, when we're done our meeting, the homework is unload the dishwasher. But in going through, all right, what gets in the way of doing that? How we think ourselves out of psych ourselves out. Oh, it's going to take so long, and I'm not going to know where things go. I don't feel like doing it. The emotional reactions, even if it's just mild, I don't feel like doing it. And all the avoidant behaviors, well, tell you what, let me check my social media feed first. Then I'll be in the mood to unload the dishwasher. All of a sudden now, rather than trying harder and harder to not procrastinate, we have 3 different things you could work on to try to and there's other ways to reframe it, like, just focus on the top rack, things like that. So the session now, it's not like there's a separate cognitive behavioral therapy for unloading the dishwasher. Okay, we're done with that. Oh, you want to do your homework too? Oh, we got to do. No, the things generalize and we go through, and it is iterative, meaning that, you may do the dishwasher, or maybe you don't do the dishwasher or your homework or whatever it is. That's where we come back and let's understand how you don't do things. What got in the way this time? And was there something else we didn't factor in? Did we set too high of an expectation for the task? Okay, maybe we need to break it down into smaller elements. And that's the personalization of it too, because sometimes people might have a history of something. Just because I used the dishwasher, maybe that person got criticized by their parents for never putting things away So in addition to ADHD procrastination, there's that layer of, just because we used the phrase before, rejection sensitivity, I'm going to do it wrong, that is very emotionally loaded. And it's only when we figured out, like, what's another reason you might not be doing it? And then we get to that level. So there's still, a lot of the thinking, feeling, and behavior that goes into it, but it's going through the lens of, let's understand your ADHD and how you can generalize this to other tasks, including having a plan, viewing relationships. This is probably one of the many reasons I lost my job at Hallmark Cards, but viewing relationships in one way to make it actionable as various tasks. What are things you can do that your partner might appreciate? Or what did you agree to do with your partner in a check-in? How can we increase the likelihood that you'll follow through on that so you can, contribute? And also another thing that folks with ADHD, I think is an underutilized strategy, is asking for and accepting help. Could you help me do this? Or, or letting people know. Some other things came up, and sometimes it's not ADHD. My child was sick. I had to stay home from work because they had to be home at school. I wasn't able to work on your project. I won't be able to hand it in on Friday. I'll have it to you Monday. And allowing other people to adapt to them. But also with ADHD, setting limits and saying no to other people when appropriate too, instead of saying yes all the time, to be in people's good graces, but then being overwhelmed and not being able to follow through. But going back to, I think procrastination is usually a meeting point for a lot of the coping skills. So that's usually the thing, including procrastinating because you don't make a plan, because, well, if I make a plan, that's my recipe for failure. Well, let's deal with that so that, because if you just rely on winging it, I'll figure it out when I wake up tomorrow. That's also a high cognitive load task that for everybody is not very efficient.
Now, you've written 6 books on ADHD, which all look amazing. I think I'm going to get rethinking adult ADHD and adults with ADHD, because I've got people in my life that have ADHD. So what is that? Is that a good book to start off with? What would be your
rethinking book? That's one I'm proud on. What I did with that one is the focus. It's a central focus on cognitions, like what I was just saying. Like, I think I've said before, and I make the contention in that book that and this is anecdotal, it needs to be researched, but, within cognitive therapy, classic cognitive therapy started off as a treatment for depression, then anxiety, and then a whole host of other things. And even though some of the cognitive distortions, like all or nothing thinking, fortune telling, catastrophizing, they're the same across the board, there's different themes. Like, so for for depression, the main theme of somebody's thoughts is generally loss. I didn't get the job. The person broke up with me. The loss of a future. I'm never going to get better. I'm never going to amount to anything. With anxiety, it's perception of risk, or we're increasingly understanding the intolerance of uncertainty. Even if I start working on the project now, it's not going to be any good. Or with the uncertainty, I just don't know if I'm going to be able to focus or how good it's going to be or if I'm going to get it done on time. So I'll put it off till later. And somebody had asked me early on, like, what's the theme in ADHD? And it stuck with me. So I finally wrote the book about it. And so the main theme, I'd say, is self-mistrust. I know I can do it, but I can't trust myself that I will be able to get myself to do it when I need to do it. So it really focuses on the cognitive interventions in wide-ranging ways, and even is self-serving. But going back to the ADHD and the intolerance of uncertainty, there's at least some emerging preliminary evidence that that uncertainty theme resonates within ADHD. So the book that just got released is the Adult ADHD and Anxiety Workbook, where that uncertainty theme. Like I say, ADHD is an uncertainty or entropy generator, a chaos generator, so it makes sense that anxiety, which is usually neck and neck with depression in terms of studies of the most common coexisting emotional diagnoses, even if in subthreshold form, anxiety usually comes out a little bit ahead, probably followed by depression afterwards, because you can have both. But dealing with that uncertainty, I know I can do it, but I don't know if I will do it, or will it, or even if I work and hand in the paper, my essay for class, will I get a failing grade? And why bother doing it at all? And maybe that person has a history of, okay, I submit things, but they're no good and I have to redo them over, or it was wasted time. Sometimes the thoughts and feelings are based on past experience. And it doesn't mean that they can't be overcome, but that's the experience of many adults with ADHD. So yeah, I have fun thoughts about the Rethinking book. Pretty much our workbook of the series of tools. I mean, all of them have tools, but when
you say workbook, this is the adult ADHD toolkit?
Well, that would be the workbook that went along with our CBT manual, if you will. So that's there's some updates on some of those skills in the more recent workbook, the adult ADHD and anxiety workbook. That the anxiety work that just got released 3 weeks ago. Actually, 3 weeks ago.
So this is written for people with ADHD to work through?
Yes, and so is the toolkit. But the workbook, this one has a lot more lines and exercises, than the toolkit. Hopefully, one of these days, it seems, I think the publisher wants me to do a second edition on the workbook, on the adult ADHD toolkit. I'm sorry, so that'll be forthcoming whenever I get around to it. But just got some other things working on right now.
Fantastic. Russell, thank you so much for coming in. Where can people find these workbooks and all your books that you've written?
I've got a website, www.cbt, like in cognitive behavioral therapy, the letter CBT, the number 4, ADHD.com. So they're listed on there, but probably any online retailers you can find them. But there's links to them on my website. And it's
Thank
not,
you, Russell.
Sometimes people see here CBD, and they get really excited. No, it's CBT, like cognitive behavioral therapy for ADHD. No, it's a pleasure. You ask great questions. I appreciate, having this opportunity.
No worries, Russell. Thank you so much. The One Moment Please podcast.
Yeah.